The order to depart came when the evening shadows were already stretching long across the water. It was not a time when seasoned fishermen usually set sail toward the open sea, especially not toward the eastern shore. That side belonged to the Gentiles, a place of strange customs and unfamiliar gods, a land that decent men from Capernaum avoided. Yet, the teacher had spoken with a quiet finality that brooked no argument. He wanted to cross over. Simon Peter gripped the rough wood of the tiller, his knuckles white. He looked at the sky. There were no clouds, no shifts in the wind that signaled a coming squall. Yet the hair on his arms stood on end. He felt a heaviness in his chest, a sensation that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a primal instinct he could not name. It felt as though they were being watched, not by human eyes, but by something vast and malevolent lurking beneath the dark surface of the Sea of Galilee. They pushed off. The boat, sturdy and smelling of tar and fish, cut through the black water. For the first hour, the only sounds were the rhythmic dipping of oars and the low murmurs of the 12 men. Jesus had moved to the stern, finding a cushion on the wooden planks. Within moments, he was asleep, his breathing steady and deep, completely detached from the tension that gripped his followers. Then, it happened. It did not begin with rain or thunder. It began with a sudden, violent drop in air pressure that made their ears pop. The wind did not build up gradually. It slammed into them like a physical hammer. The sail, which had been hanging limp, snapped taut with a sound like a cracking whip. The boat heeled over sharply, sending James and John tumbling across the deck. "Reef the sail! Cut the lines!" Peter screamed, his voice barely audible over the sudden roar of the gale. This was no ordinary storm. Peter had lived his entire life on this water. He knew the moods of Galilee. He knew how the wind rushed down from the northern mountains to churn the bowl of the lake. But this was different. The wind was swirling from all directions at once, spinning the vessel like a toy. The waves did not just roll. They struck with malicious intent, smashing against the hull as if trying to break the boat's spine. Water poured over the gunwales, cold and relentless. Thomas and Matthew grabbed buckets, bailing frantically, but for every bucket they threw out, the sea dumped 3 more in. The boat was heavy, sluggish, sinking lower with every passing second. "It is going to break apart," Andrew yelled, clutching a rope with one hand and shielding his face from the stinging spray with the other. "We are taking on too much water." The darkness was absolute now. They could not see the shore they had left, nor the one they were heading toward. They were trapped in a chaotic void. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through their discipline. These were men who knew how to die at sea, but the terror gripping them now was supernatural. It felt as though the abyss itself was rising to swallow them whole, to stop them from reaching the other side. Through the chaos, John looked toward the stern. A flash of lightning illuminated the boat, and what he saw made him freeze. Jesus was still sleeping. The water was sloshing around his feet. The boat was pitching violently enough to throw a man overboard, yet the teacher lay there, undisturbed, as if he were resting in a quiet garden. "Teacher!" The cry was torn from the throats of the disciples. It was a plea of desperation. They scrambled toward him, slipping on the wet deck. Peter grabbed Jesus by the shoulder and shook him hard. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation and terror. They were dying, and he was sleeping. Jesus opened his eyes. There was no grogginess, no disorientation. He looked up at the frantic faces of his friends. Then he looked out at the raging darkness. He did not grab a rope. He did not pick up a bucket. He stood up. The boat lurched beneath him, but he found his footing with effortless grace. He looked into the heart of the wind. He stared down the crushing waves. It was a confrontation. He was not speaking to the weather. He was speaking to the force behind it. "Peace," he said, his voice not loud, but cutting through the roar like a sword. "Be still." The reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly absolute. The wind did not die down. It ceased. The waves did not gradually settle. They flattened instantly, as if an invisible hand had pressed them down. The howling stopped. The creaking of the timbers stopped. In the span of a single heartbeat, the violence of a hurricane was replaced by a silence so profound it was almost painful. The boat drifted gently on glass-like water. The only sound left was the ragged breathing of the 12 men. They dropped their buckets. They let go of the ropes. They looked at the calm sea. Then they looked at Jesus. He turned to them, his expression one of disappointment, not in their skill, but in their hearts. "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" But they could not answer. A new fear had replaced the fear of the storm. It was the fear of the holy. They whispered to one another, huddled together at the front of the boat, eyeing the man who sat back down on the cushion. "Who can this be?" they asked, their voices trembling. "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They realized then that the danger they had just faced was nothing compared to the power sitting in their boat, and as the vessel drifted silently toward the forbidding coast of the Gadarenes, they understood that the storm had been a barrier. Something on the other side had tried to stop them, and whatever it was, they were now heading straight for it. Your support gives a voice to the stories that darkness tries to silence. Like and subscribe to help us reveal the truths that many refuse to speak. Stay with us because the storm on the sea was only the beginning, and you will not believe what happens when they step onto that shore. The boat grounded on the sand with a harsh, grinding noise that echoed in the stillness. It was the middle of the night, and the moon was hidden behind a thick veil of high clouds, leaving the coast of the Gadarenes draped in shadows. The air here was different. It did not smell of salt and fresh water. It smelled of stagnant earth, decaying leaves, and something metallic, like old blood. Jesus was the first to step over the side. His feet splashed into the shallow water, and he walked onto the pebbled beach without hesitation. The disciples followed, but slowly. Peter kept his hand near the small knife he used for cutting nets. Thomas stayed close to the boat, his eyes darting toward the looming limestone cliffs that rose sharply from the shore. There was no town here, no harbor master to greet them, no lights from fishermen's cottages. There were only the tombs. Carved directly into the soft rock of the hillsides were hundreds of caves, burial chambers for the dead of the nearby cities. It was a place unclean by every law they followed. No righteous man would walk here willingly. "We should not stay here," James whispered, his voice tight. "This place, it feels wrong." "He has a reason," John replied, though he sounded unconvinced. He wrapped his cloak tighter around himself, shivering despite the warm night air. The silence of the region was not empty. It was heavy, oppressive, like a held breath waiting to be released. They had barely taken 10 paces onto the dry land when the silence was shattered. It began as a low growl, vibrating from the darkness of the tombs above them. Then came the sound of metal striking stone, clank, drag, clank. It was the sound of broken chains being dragged across rock. The disciples froze, forming a protective semicircle, their eyes strained against the dark. From the black mouth of one of the largest tombs, a figure emerged. It was a man, or at least, it had once been a man. He was naked, his skin caked with layers of dirt, dried blood, and filth. His hair was a matted mane that obscured his face. But it was his movement that was truly terrifying. He did not walk, he lurched, throwing his body forward with unnatural speed, scrambling over sharp rocks that should have sliced his feet to ribbons. "Stay back!" Peter shouted, stepping in front of the others. But the figure did not stop. He threw his head back and let out a scream that froze the blood in their veins. It was not a human cry. It was a cacophony of voices screaming in unison, a sound of pure torment and rage that echoed off the cliffs and rolled out over the water. It was the sound of a soul being shredded from the inside out. The man was bleeding. In his hand, he gripped a sharp stone, and as he ran, he slashed at his own chest and arms, fresh blood flowing over old scars. He was a ruin of a human being, a vessel of absolute misery. "He is mad," Thomas gasped, taking a step back toward the water. "He will kill us." The creature was sprinting now, rushing straight toward Jesus with the ferocity of a wild beast. The disciples braced for violence. They expected him to tackle the teacher, to tear at him with those jagged stones and broken fingernails. But Jesus did not move. He did not raise a hand to defend himself. He stood perfectly still, an anchor of calm in the face of the onrushing nightmare. 10 feet away, 5 feet away. The creature's momentum was unstoppable, yet at the last possible second, he collapsed. He did not attack. He threw himself into the dirt, sliding until he was at Jesus' feet. The violent momentum vanished, replaced by a trembling so severe his teeth chattered audibly. The disciples watched in stunned silence. The man who had terrified the entire region, the monster who broke iron chains and howled at the moon, was now groveling in the sand. He did not look up. He pressed his face into the earth, clawing at the ground. Then a voice spoke from within him. It was not the voice of the man. It was guttural, deep, and layered, as if many throats were speaking at once. "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" The disciples recoiled. How did this madman know him? They had just arrived. No one on this side of the sea knew the teacher's face. Yet this thing, this entity living in the filth of the tombs, knew exactly who stood before it. The voice continued, shifting in pitch, sounding like a desperate plea wrapped in a snarl. "I beg you, by God, do not torment me." Jesus looked down at the shivering heap of humanity. He did not speak to the man's madness. He spoke to the captor holding the man hostage. The air grew cold, and the tension on the beach spiked. The spiritual weight of the moment was crushing. This was not a conversation. It was a confrontation between two kingdoms. "Come out of the man, unclean spirit," Jesus commanded. His tone was not loud, but it carried the same absolute authority that had flattened the waves an hour before. The man on the ground convulsed violently, his back arching, his limbs twisting at impossible angles. The entities within him were resisting, holding on to their prize with desperate claws. They had owned this man for years. They had worn him like a garment, used him to terrify the living and mock the image of God. They would not leave without a fight. Jesus took a step closer. He was not intimidated by the display. He needed to expose the depth of the darkness so that the light could fully enter. "What is your name?" Jesus asked. The man's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, the pupils fully dilated, swallowing the irises. When he opened his mouth, a smile stretched across his face, a rictus of pain and arrogance. The voice that answered was the sound of a marching army. "My name is Legion," the voice hissed, "for we are many." The word hung in the night air. Legion, a Roman military term, 6,000 soldiers. The disciples understood the horror of the confession. This was not one demon. This was an army of darkness crammed into the fragile mind of a single human being. No wonder the chains broke. No wonder the man howled. He was a battlefield. And now, the war had come to the beach. To the 12 men standing on the beach, the figure before them was a monster, a terrifying anomaly that belonged in a nightmare. But inside that ruin of a body, buried beneath layers of filth and madness, a human soul still flickered, trapped in a cage of bone and blood. He remembered, though the memories were fragmented like shards of broken pottery, a time before the darkness. He remembered the warmth of a hearth fire. He remembered the sound of a woman's voice calling a name that no longer belonged to him. He remembered the laughter of children and the weight of a fishing net in his hands. But those memories were dangerous. Every time he tried to grasp them, the voices would scream, drowning out the past with waves of agonizing noise. The transition from man to beast had not happened in a single day. It had begun as a whisper, a shadow at the corner of his vision, a coldness that would not leave his bones. Then came the fits. At first, the people of the town had been sympathetic. They brought him herbs and offered prayers. But as the shadows grew longer and the whispers turned into commands, their sympathy turned to fear. He looked down at his wrists, though he could barely see them through the matted hair and dried mud. The scars there were thick, raised welts, where iron had bitten into his flesh. He remembered the day the town magistrate had ordered him bound. 4 strong men had held him down. He had screamed, not in anger, but in terror, begging them not to leave him alone in the dark. They had shackled his hands and feet with heavy chains, the kind used for dangerous criminals or wild animals. "It is for your own good," they had said, their eyes averting his gaze. "It is for the safety of the town." But they did not understand. The chains were made of iron, forged by human hands. The power that surged through his veins was not human. When the sun went down and the true torment began, the iron felt like dry twigs. He remembered the sensation of the metal snapping, the sound of links exploding outward as the entity within him flexed its power. He had broken them, not once, but many times. He had shattered shackles and snapped fetters as if they were thread. The townspeople had given up. They realized they could not hold him. So they drove him out. They chased him with torches and stones. forcing him away from the warmth of the living and into the domain of the dead. For years now, the tombs had been his only home. The limestone caves were cold and damp, smelling of decay. He slept on stone slabs where bodies had once laid. He scavenged for food like a jackal. But the hunger in his belly was nothing compared to the hunger of the things inside him. They were never satisfied. They demanded pain. They reveled in his suffering. When the voices became too loud, when the pressure in his skull felt like it would split him open, he would pick up the sharp flints that littered the ground. He would drag the jagged edges across his chest, his arms, his legs. The sharp bite of physical pain was the only thing that could distract him from the spiritual agony. The blood that flowed was a release, a temporary silence in the cacophony of his mind. He was a prisoner in his own skin. He could see his hands moving, but he could not stop them. He could hear his mouth screaming, but he could not silence it. He was a passenger in a vehicle careening off a cliff, forced to watch the destruction of his own existence. He had longed for death, begged for it, but the spirits would not let him die. They kept him alive, fueling his body with unnatural strength so that he could continue to be their playground. Until tonight. Tonight, something had changed. The atmosphere had shifted. The man, buried deep inside the monster, had felt it before the boat even touched the sand. It was a pull, a magnetic force of purity that terrified the demons but gave the man a spark of impossible hope. The interior of the man's mind was not a void, it was a battlefield. It was a crowded, suffocating room where thousands of voices shouted over one another, a ceaseless riot of malice and hatred. This was the reality of the Legion. They were not a single entity but a collective, a hive mind of fallen spirits, united by a singular purpose: to steal, to kill, and to destroy. They had found this vessel years ago, a man with a wounded spirit, a crack in his armor that they had widened until they could pour themselves in, one by one, then 100 by 100. They had entered. They had systematically dismantled his will, isolating him from his creator and his community until he was theirs completely. But now, the Legion was afraid. The fear rippled through the collective consciousness like a shockwave. It had started when the storm on the sea suddenly died. They had stirred the winds. They had whipped the water into a frenzy to sink the wooden vessel approaching their territory. They knew who was on that boat: the Son of the Most High, the enemy, the one who held the keys to their ultimate prison. When the command piece, "Be still," echoed across the water, the Legion trembled. The authority in that voice was absolute. It bypassed the laws of nature and struck directly at the spiritual roots of the storm. They knew then that he was coming for them. Panic ensued within the man. The spirits fought for control. Some wanted to flee into the wilderness, to abandon the host and scatter into the desert places. Others wanted to attack, to use the man's supernatural strength to crush the Galilean before he could speak. The chaos inside the man's head was deafening. "He is here! He is here! Run! We must hide! No! Destroy him! Tear him apart!" The man's body jerked and twitched as the conflicting commands fired through his nervous system. But beneath the chaos, the remnant of the human soul saw his chance. He did not know theology. He did not know the prophecies. He only knew that the presence standing on the beach felt like the opposite of the hell he lived in. It felt like silence. It felt like peace. With a surge of will that surprised even the demons, the man forced his legs to move. He did not run away from the danger. He ran toward the light. The Legion screamed in protest, trying to turn him back, trying to make him pick up a stone, trying to make him bite his own tongue, but the pull of Jesus was stronger. It drew the man in like a moth to a flame. When he collapsed at Jesus' feet, it was a surrender on two fronts. The man surrendered to hope, and the Legion surrendered to authority. "What is your name?" Jesus had asked. The question was a weapon. It forced the darkness to identify itself. It stripped away the anonymity that evil uses to hide. The demons could not remain silent. They had to answer to the Creator. "Legion," they confessed, speaking through the man's vocal cords, distorting his voice into a growl that carried the weight of thousands, "for we are many." The admission was a tactical defeat. By giving their name, they acknowledged his jurisdiction over them. They were an army, yes. They were 6,000 strong, capable of routing a Roman cohort or terrorizing a province. But here, on this beach, in the presence of this one man, they were powerless. They looked at Jesus through the man's eyes and saw no fear. They saw only calm, judicial authority. They knew the ancient texts better than any scribe. They knew that a time was appointed for their judgment, a time when they would be cast into the abyss, the bottomless pit of fire and darkness prepared for the devil and his angels. "Do not send us there," they pleaded, their arrogance crumbling into desperation. "Not yet. The time has not yet come." The internal dialogue of the legion shifted from aggression to survival. They needed a host. To be disembodied was a torment they could not bear. To be sent to the abyss was a finality they dreaded. They scanned the surroundings frantically. They saw the steep slopes. They saw the rocks. And then, in the distance, they saw the herd. Swine, unclean beasts, fit only for scavengers. "Send us into the pigs," the collective voice begged, a humiliating request for fallen angels who had once stood in the courts of heaven. "Let us enter them." It was a desperate gamble. They would trade a human soul for the bodies of animals. Anything to avoid the abyss. Anything to remain on the earth a little longer, and the man's heart pounded in his chest. A drumbeat of anticipation. He could feel the entities coiling, preparing to leap, waiting for the command that would either destroy him or set him free. The war for his soul had reached its climax, and the entire army of darkness held its breath, waiting for the word of the king. The confrontation on the shoreline had moved beyond a mere encounter between a healer and a madman. It had become a legal proceeding in the spiritual court, presided over by the judge of all creation. The man lay prone in the grit, his body trembling not from cold, but from the violent vibration of the 6,000 entities crowded within his soul. They were terrified. For centuries, these spirits had roamed the earth, seeking rest in dry places and finding none, eventually settling like parasites into vulnerable hosts. They reveled in chaos. They fed on pain. But now, faced with the Son of the Most High, their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a primal dread of what lay beneath. They knew about the abyss. It was not a metaphor to them. It was a literal, geographical reality in the spiritual topography, a prison of absolute confinement, a darkness so thick it choked the very essence of a spirit. It was the place of torment prepared for the rebellious, a holding cell for the final judgment. They knew their destiny was to end there, but they also knew the timeline. The appointed time of their final sentencing had not yet arrived. "I adjure you by God," the voice of Legion rasped, sounding like grinding stones, "do not send us into the abyss." The demons were pleading for a stay of execution. To be stripped of a body, to be cast naked into that prison before the final day, was a fate they feared more than anything else. They needed a vessel. Without a vessel, they were exposed. With a vessel, they could continue to interact with the physical world, to mar and destroy God's creation. Jesus stood silent, his gaze penetrating the layers of the man's psyche. He did not engage in a debate. He did not need to bargain. His silence was the weight of authority. He waited, forcing the darkness to expose its own nature. Desperation seized the legion. If they could not stay in the man, and if they could not roam free, they needed a substitute. Their collective consciousness swept across the landscape, searching frantically for a host that would be permitted. They could not enter the disciples standing nearby. Those men were protected, sealed by a power the demons could not breach. They could not enter the earth or the stones. Then, their attention locked onto the steep hillside nearby. A massive herd of swine was grazing there, about 2,000 of them. In the eyes of the law given to Moses, these animals were unclean. They were forbidden to the people of God, symbols of dietary and ritual impurity. To the demons, they were perfect. They were compatible vessels for uncleanness. "Send us to the pigs," the legion begged, the voices merging into a singular, frantic cry. "Let us enter them." It was a revelation of their character. They would rather inhabit the bodies of beasts than face the justice of God. They preferred the mud and filth of the swine pen to the purity of the spiritual realm. It also revealed their intent. They knew that entering the pigs would likely destroy the animals, devastating the livelihood of the town. Even in their defeat, they sought to cause economic ruin and social chaos. They wanted to leave a scar on the land, even if they were evicted from the man. Jesus looked at the trembling man, then at the distant herd. He knew what would happen. He knew the cost. 2,000 animals against one human soul. In the economy of the kingdom of heaven, the math was simple. The soul of one man, no matter how broken, how scarred, how demonized, was worth more than all the wealth of the Decapolis. He spoke only one word. It was a command that shattered the chains binding the man's soul, a decree of eviction that no power in hell could resist. Go. The moment the command left his lips, the transfer was instantaneous and violent. The man on the ground arched his back one last time, a guttural scream tearing from his throat. It was not a scream of pain, but of expulsion. It was the sound of a dam breaking. A dark, invisible shockwave erupted from his body. The pressure that had been crushing his mind for years vanished in a microsecond. The noise, the constant, maddening roar of 6,000 voices was suddenly cut off. He collapsed onto the sand, his chest heaving. For the first time in a decade, the air filling his lungs felt clean. His mind was his own. The silence inside his head was so profound it felt heavy. He was empty, but it was a blessed emptiness. The intruders were gone, but on the hillside, chaos erupted. The unseen army of spirits struck the herd of swine like a physical blow. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. 2,000 animals, moments before grazing peacefully or sleeping, were suddenly seized by a collective madness. The demons, compressed from a human soul into animal instincts, overwhelmed the creatures' simple minds with pure terror and rage. The pigs began to shriek a high-pitched, deafening squeal that rolled down the hill like thunder. Their eyes rolled back, foam dripping from their snouts. They bit at each other, tearing flesh in a frenzy of confusion. The order of the herd disintegrated instantly. Then, as if driven by a single, suicidal command, the entire mass of animals turned toward the cliff edge. The herdsmen, who had been watching from the periphery in stunned silence, began to shout. They waved their staffs, whistling and screaming, trying to turn the animals back, but it was like trying to stop a landslide with bare hands. The swine were not reacting to human commands. They were being driven by a spiritual whip. The ground shook under the thundering hooves. Dust rose in choking clouds. The disciples on the beach watched in awe and horror as the dark wave of animals poured over the crest of the hill. The momentum was unstoppable. The lead animals were pushed by the thousands behind them, and they went over the precipice. Bodies plummeted into the sea below. Splash after splash erupted from the water, a chaotic churning of white foam and dark shapes. The squealing was cut short as the water swallowed them. It was a massacre of self-destruction. The demons, unable to control the beasts or perhaps driving them to destruction out of pure spite, rode the herd down to death. Within minutes, it was over. The hillside was empty. The dust began to settle. The sea, which had been churned into a frenzy by the falling bodies, slowly returned to its rhythmic lapping against the shore. 2,000 lives had been extinguished. The wealth of the town, the food source for the region, was gone, drowned in the depths. On the beach, the contrast was stark. The noise of the destruction had faded, leaving a ringing silence. The man who had been Legion sat up slowly. He looked at his hands. He touched his face. He looked at the water where the pigs had vanished. Then he turned his eyes to the man standing above him. The wildness was gone from his eyes. The animalistic tension had left his muscles. He was weak, exhausted, and naked, but he was sane. He began to weep. These were not the tears of despair that he had shed in the tombs. They were tears of release. He reached out and touched the hem of Jesus' garment, not daring to speak, his gratitude too deep for language. Jesus looked down at him with infinite compassion. The storm on the sea had been silenced. The storm in the man's soul had been silenced. But up on the cliffs, the herdsmen were running. They were sprinting toward the city, their faces pale with terror, carrying news that would bring the entire town out to confront the one who valued a single broken man more than their entire economy. The spiritual battle was won, but the conflict with the hearts of men was just beginning. The silence on the beach was in sharp contrast to the chaotic noise tearing through the hills. The men who had been charged with watching the herd did not look back at the sea. They ran with a desperation born of absolute terror. These were rough men, hired hands accustomed to long nights in the open and the occasional threat of wolves or bandits. But they had never witnessed a catastrophe of this magnitude. They had seen the invisible wind of madness strike the animals. They had seen the eyes of the beasts turn wild, and they had felt the ground shake as thousands of living creatures rushed to their deaths. They scrambled up the goat paths, their lungs burning, their legs heavy with exhaustion. They did not stop until they reached the outskirts of the city. It was a settlement of commerce and trade, a place where the value of a thing was measured in silver and copper, not in souls. The daily rhythm of the market was at its peak when the herdsmen burst in, their clothes torn and their faces pale with shock. "They are gone!" the lead herdsman shouted, his voice cracking. "The entire herd gone." People stopped in the streets. Merchants looked up from their ledgers. Shoppers froze. The panic in the man's voice was contagious. "What are you saying?" a merchant demanded, stepping out from a stall. "What has happened to the livestock?" "Dead," the herdsman gasped, collapsing onto a stone bench. "All of them, drowned in the sea." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathering crowd. It was impossible. A few animals might fall, or a sickness might take a dozen, but an entire herd of 2,000 swine did not simply vanish into the water. This represented a fortune. It was the livelihood of several wealthy families, the primary export of the region. "You are drunk," a voice boomed. A heavy-set man, one of the owners of the herd, pushed his way through the crowd. His face was red with anger. "You have left your post, and now you come with wild tales to cover your negligence." "It is no tale," the herdsman cried, looking up with eyes that had seen the impossible. "We saw it. A man came from the sea. A Jewish teacher. He did not touch the herd. He spoke to the madman." The crowd grew quieter at the mention of the madman. Everyone knew of the terror who lived in the tombs. He was a shadow over their city, a reason to lock doors at night, a monster they had tried and failed to bind. "The one from the tombs?" the owner asked, his voice lower now. "What did he do? Did he chase the animals?" "No," the herdsman shook his head violently. "The spirits, the things that lived inside him, they asked to leave. They begged the teacher to let them enter the swine." The owner stared at him, trying to process the absurdity of the statement. "And he allowed it?" He spoke one word, the herdsman whispered, trembling at the memory, and the man fell down as if dead. "But the pigs went mad." It was as if the legion of hell transferred from the man to the beasts in the blink of an eye. They ran off the cliff, every single one. The implications began to sink in. The financial loss was catastrophic, a blow that would cripple the local economy for seasons to come. But beneath the anger of the loss lay a creeping dread. If this stranger had the power to command the spirits that had terrified their city for years, and if he had the power to destroy a fortune with a single word, then he was dangerous. He was a force they could not control, buy, or intimidate. "Where is this man now?" the owner demanded. "Still by the sea," the herdsman replied, "with the madman." "Then we must go," the owner declared, looking around at the other elders and merchants. "We must see this for ourselves. And we must deal with this stranger before he destroys anything else." The city mobilized. It was not a joyful procession. It was a march of fearful curiosity and defensive anger. Men closed their shops. Women peered from windows. A great multitude poured out of the city gates, flowing down the winding road toward the sea. They were not going to worship. They were going to investigate a disaster. As they descended the hills, the anger of the owners fueled the crowd. They spoke of restitution, of demanding payment for the lost property. They spoke of driving the intruder away. They did not care about the miracle of a healed mind. They cared about the tragedy of lost profit. But as they neared the shore, the angry murmuring began to die down. The scene that awaited them was not one of chaos, but of unnerving stillness. There was the boat, resting on the sand. There were the 12 men who traveled with the teacher, standing protectively nearby. And there, sitting on a large stone, was the man they had all feared. The crowd stopped. They stood at a distance, their eyes wide. They expected to see the monster, the naked, bleeding, screaming creature who threw stones and broke chains. Instead, they saw a man clothed in a tunic that one of the disciples had given him. He was not screaming. He was not cutting himself. He was sitting quietly, listening to the teacher. His hair was pushed back from his face, and his eyes, once wild and rolling, were clear and focused. He looked up as the crowd approached. There was no aggression in his gaze, only a profound peace. He recognized the faces of the men who had once chased him with torches, the men who had chained him like a dog. But he did not recoil. He simply looked at them, a living testimony to a power they could not comprehend. The owner of the herd stepped forward, his mouth opening to demand an explanation for his lost property, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the calm water where his fortune had sunk, and then he looked at the man who had been the vessel of a legion. Fear seized the crowd. It was not the fear of violence, it was the fear of the holy. They were standing in the presence of someone who could rewrite the laws of nature and the spirit world. The sheer magnitude of the change in the demoniac was more terrifying to them than his madness had ever been. His madness was predictable. This power was not. The leading merchant turned to the herdsmen, who were cowering at the back of the group. "Is this the man?" he whispered harshly. "Is this the one who lived in the tombs?" "It is him," the herdsman replied. "Look at the scars on his arms. It is him." The crowd shifted uneasily. They did not know what to do. They had come to confront a destroyer, but they found a restorer. Yet, the cost of this restoration hung heavy in the air. The empty hillside where the pigs used to graze was a silent accusation. This Jesus brought freedom, yes, but he brought it at a price they were not willing to pay. The atmosphere grew tense, not with worship, but with a cold, rejecting resolve. They did not want this kind of power in their borders. It cost too much. The standoff on the shore was a silent war of values. On one side stood the Son of the Most High, the author of life, who had just performed an act of supreme mercy. On the other side stood the elders of the city, the merchants, and the crowd, representing a community that had just suffered a devastating financial blow. Between them sat the man who was once a terror, now a living monument to grace. The leader of the city council stepped forward. He was a man accustomed to command, a man whose word was law in the marketplace. But as he looked at Jesus, his confidence wavered. He could not look the teacher in the eye. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the sand near Jesus' feet. "We know what you have done," the elder began, his voice shaking slightly. "We have heard the report of the herdsmen. The swine are dead. Our wealth is destroyed." Jesus did not defend himself. He did not apologize for the loss of the livestock. He stood with the calm assurance of one who knows that the soul of a single human being outweighs the cattle on 1,000 hills. He waited for them to speak their hearts. "We see this man," the elder continued, gesturing vaguely toward the restored demoniac without looking at him directly. "We see that he is changed. We acknowledge the power you possess. It is a power beyond anything our priests or physicians can summon." The crowd murmured in agreement. They were terrified. If this man could command a legion of spirits to destroy a herd of animals, what else could he do? Could he command their crops to wither? Could he call down fire? Could he overthrow their governors? His power was too absolute, too unpredictable. It threatened the fragile order of their society. "We do not understand you," the elder said, his voice hardening with resolve, "and we cannot afford you. Your presence here brings disruption. You have been on our shores for less than a morning, and already you have cost us more than we can bear." The verdict was in. They did not want to know who he was. They did not want to hear his teaching. They did not want him to heal their sick or comfort their mourning. They wanted him gone. They preferred the devil. They knew the occasional terror of the madman in the tombs to the Holy One who demanded the surrender of everything. "Depart from us," the elder said, the words heavy and final. "We beg you, leave our coasts, go back to where you came from, and leave us in peace." It was a polite rejection, but a rejection nonetheless. It was the collective voice of humanity saying that they valued their economy more than their salvation. They looked at the man who was healed, a man who was likely a son, a brother, or a father to people in that very crowd, and they decided that his freedom was too expensive. The disciples bristled with indignation. Peter stepped forward, his hand clenching into a fist. He wanted to argue. He wanted to shout at these ungrateful people, to tell them that they were casting away the greatest gift heaven had ever offered. He wanted to point out that their pigs were unclean anyway, that their priorities were twisted. But Jesus raised a hand, silencing Peter before he could speak. There was no anger in Jesus' face, only a deep, tragic sadness. He does not stay where he is not wanted. He does not force his kingdom upon those who choose the kingdom of self. He respects the free will of man, even when that will choose his darkness. He nodded once to the elder. Then, without a word of condemnation, he turned his back on the city. He walked toward the water's edge. He signaled to the disciples to prepare the boat. The rejection was absolute, and his departure would be immediate. As Jesus turned toward the sea, panic seized the heart of the restored man. For the last few hours, he had existed in a state of blissful shock. The silence in his mind was a sanctuary. But as he watched the teacher prepare to leave, the old terror came rushing back. He looked at the tombs in the distance, those dark, gaping mouths that had swallowed years of his life. He looked at the townspeople who were staring at him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. He realized with sudden clarity that if Jesus left, he would be alone. He was a man with no home, no money, and a reputation that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Who would hire him? Who would let him sleep in their house? And worse, the terrifying thought that kept his heart hammering against his ribs. What if the legion returned? What if the silence was temporary? What if, the moment the boat disappeared over the horizon, the voices came back, angry and vengeful, to drag him back into the madness? He could not stay here. He had to be with the one who commanded the darkness. He scrambled up from the stone where he had been sitting. He ran into the shallow water, splashing toward the boat just as the disciples were pushing it off the sand. He grabbed the gunwale with desperate hands, his knuckles white. "Lord," he cried out, his voice cracking with emotion, "let me go with you." Jesus stopped. He turned to look at the man. The disciples paused, holding the oars. "Please," the man begged, tears streaming down his face. "Do not leave me here. I will serve you. I will row the boat. I will sleep on the deck. I will do anything. Just let me be where you are. I cannot stay with them." He gestured frantically toward the crowd on the beach. "They hate me, they fear me, and I am afraid to be without you." It was a request born of love and fear. It was the request of a true disciple. He was willing to leave everything, his country, his people, his past, to follow the Messiah. By every standard, he was the perfect candidate for ministry. He had nothing holding him back. But Jesus gently pried the man's hands from the side of the boat. "No," Jesus said. The word hung in the air, shocking the man. He felt a cold wave of rejection. Was he not good enough? Was he too scarred? Was he too tainted by the years of possession to be in the company of the Holy One? "Go home," Jesus said, his voice firm but filled with an intense, empowering love. "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you." The man stared at Jesus, confused. "Home? You have a mission," Jesus told him. "I am leaving, but you are staying. You will be my voice in this place. You will go where I cannot go. You will speak to those who have just rejected me." Jesus was doing something revolutionary. He was commissioning the first missionary to the Gentile world. He was not sending a scholar or a priest or a man trained in the law. He was sending a man whose only qualification was his story. "They will not listen to a rabbi," Jesus seemed to be saying with his eyes, "but they cannot deny a man they saw dead and is now alive." "But I am afraid," the man whispered. "Do not be," Jesus reassured him. "The darkness has no claim on you anymore. You are free, not because I am standing next to you, but because the kingdom of God is within you now. Go, tell them." Jesus stepped into the boat. The disciples pushed off. The distance between the wood of the hull and the sand of the shore began to grow. The man stood knee-deep in the water, watching. He felt the crushing weight of the responsibility he had just been given. He was being asked to walk back into the very city that had just expelled his Savior. He was being asked to face the people who remembered his screams. He was being asked to be a light in a land that loved the dark. He watched until the boat was a small speck on the horizon. He watched until he could no longer distinguish the figure of the teacher from the shadows of the sea. Then he took a deep breath. He looked down at his clean hands. He touched the cloth of his tunic. He turned around. The crowd was still there, watching him warily. The elders were watching. The merchants were watching. They expected him to run back to the tombs. They expected him to collapse. Instead, he walked straight toward them. He did not lower his head in shame. He did not scream. He walked with the dignity of a man who had been in the presence of God. He walked up to the merchant who had spoken, looked him in the eye, and opened his mouth. "Let me tell you," he said, his voice steady and clear, "what the Lord has done for me. The walk from the shoreline back to the city gates was the longest journey of his life. It was not a matter of distance, for the road was short, but a matter of courage. Every step took him closer to the people who remembered his screams, the people who had thrown stones to drive him away, and the people who had mourned him as if he were already dead. He was walking back into a graveyard of memories. As he passed the boundary markers where the tombs ended and the cultivated lands began, he felt the physical urge to turn around. His body remembered the rejection even if his mind was healed. He remembered the feeling of rocks striking his back. He remembered the insults. But the command of Jesus was burning in his chest like a living coal. Go home to your friends. He entered the city gate just as the midday heat was beginning to break. The reaction was immediate. A woman carrying a water jar saw him first. She dropped the vessel, and it shattered on the pavement. She did not scream. She simply pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide with the recognition of a nightmare. It is the demoniac. A whisper ran through the street like a brush fire. The beast has returned. Shopkeepers grabbed their wares and retreated inside. Mothers pulled their children behind their skirts. Men reached for makeshift weapons, heavy sticks, loose stones, iron bars. The circle of empty space around him grew wide. They were waiting for him to snap. They were waiting for the growl, the froth, the violence. But he did not stop. He did not glare. He walked with a steady, gentle rhythm. He held his hands open at his sides to show he carried no weapon. He looked into the faces of men he had known since childhood, men whose names he could now remember. "Peace," he said softly to a baker who was clutching a rolling pin like a club. "I am not here to hurt you." The baker flinched at the sound of the voice. It was not the grinding, multi-layered voice of the Legion. It was the voice of a man, tired, dusty, but undeniably human. He continued until he reached a narrow street in the older quarter of the city. He stopped in front of a modest house with a weathered wooden door. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was the door that had been barred against him 5 years ago. This was the house where he had once sat at the table, where he had laughed, where he had been a son and a brother before the darkness took him. He raised a hand to knock, but his fingers trembled. What if they drove him away? What if they refused to believe? He knocked 3 times. Silence stretched from inside. Then, the sound of a heavy latch sliding back. The door opened a crack, held by a safety chain. A pair of eyes peered out, older, sadder, etched with lines of grief. It was his brother. The eyes widened. The door slammed shut. "Go away!" the brother's voice shouted from behind the wood, thick with panic. "We have nothing for you. Leave us be." "It is me," the man said, leaning his forehead against the rough wood. "Brother, it is truly me. I am empty of them. They are gone." "You are dead to us," the voice cried out. "You are a monster. Go back to the tombs." "I cannot," the man replied, his voice breaking. "I have met the Messiah. He has sent me home." There was a long silence. Then, the sound of weeping came from inside. The man did not leave. He slid down to sit on the doorstep, waiting. He waited as the shadows lengthened. He waited as the neighbors watched from their windows, whispering. He simply sat, sane and clothed, a silent testimony to a miracle. Finally, the latch slid back again. The door opened fully. His brother stood there, holding a lamp, looking down at the man sitting on the threshold. He looked at the clean clothes. He looked at the scars that were now healing. He looked into the eyes that were no longer black voids but filled with tears. "Your name," his brother whispered, testing him. "What is your name?" The man smiled, and for the first time in years, the smile reached his eyes. He spoke his name, the name his mother had given him, the name the demons had stolen. His brother dropped the lamp. He fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around the neck of the one who was lost. They wept together on the doorstep, a sound that pierced the tension of the street. It was not the howling of demons. It was the sobbing of restoration. And in that embrace, the city began to understand that the power which had drowned their pigs had given them back a son. The reunion was only the beginning. Jesus had not just commanded him to go home, he had commanded him to tell the story. The boundaries of his home were too small for the magnitude of the miracle. Within a week, the man could no longer stay inside. The fire in his bones compelled him to move. He began to travel. He left the safety of his reclaimed family, and ventured out into the Decapolis, the League of 10 cities that dominated the region. He went to Gadara first. He stood in the marketplace, not as a beggar, but as a herald. He did not have the training of a scribe. He could not quote the ancient prophets or debate the finer points of the law. He had no scroll. He had only his body and his memory. He rolled up his sleeves to show the thick, white scars where the chains had cut to the bone. He showed the jagged marks on his chest where he had slashed himself with stones. "Look," he declared to the crowds that gathered. "You knew the terror that lived in the tombs. You knew the screams that kept you awake at night. I was that terror. I was the home of a legion." The crowds listened, spellbound. They liked stories of horror, but this was a story of conquest. "A man came from the sea," he told them, his voice ringing with conviction. "He did not bring an army. He did not bring a sword. He brought authority. He spoke to the darkness inside me, and the darkness fled. He commanded the storm in my soul to be still, and it obeyed." He traveled to Gerasa, then to Pella, then to Scythopolis. In each city, the reaction was the same. Skepticism turned to shock, and shock turned to marvel. The story of the drowned pigs had preceded him, traveling on the lips of merchants and traders, but the sight of the man himself was the undeniable proof. He became a living signpost. He was not asking them to follow him. He was pointing them to the one who had left. "He is the Son of the Most High," the man proclaimed in the shadow of pagan temples. "Your gods are stone and silence. Your spirits demand blood and fear. But this man, he gave his mercy to a wretch like me. He valued my soul more than the wealth of a city." The transformation of the region was slow but deep. The fear that had initially caused the people to beg Jesus to leave began to turn into a strange, hungry curiosity. They started to ask questions. Who was this teacher? Where did he come from? When would he return? The man did not know when Jesus would come back. He only knew that he had to prepare the way. He was tilling the soil of their hearts, breaking up the hard ground of paganism and fear with the plowshare of his testimony. One evening, in the city of Philadelphia, a group of Greek philosophers approached him. They were men of logic, accustomed to debating the nature of the soul and the cosmos. "You speak of this exorcism as a fact," one philosopher said, eyeing him critically. "But how do we know it was not simply a madness of the mind that passed with time? How do we know this Jesus is not a sorcerer?" The man looked at them. He did not engage in their philosophical arguments. He simply looked at them with the intense, terrifying clarity of someone who has seen the other side of reality. "I know the difference between madness and possession," he said quietly. "I know the weight of 6,000, and I know the lightness of freedom. A sorcerer binds you with spells. This man set me free with a word. You argue about the nature of the gods. I met the one who commands them. His words silenced them. There was an authority in his experience that no logic could dismantle." As the months passed, the man continued his circuit of the 10 cities. He became known not as the demoniac of Gadara, but as the messenger of mercy. He was clearing a path in the spiritual wilderness. He was ensuring that the next time the boat of the teacher touched the sands of the Decapolis, the people would not meet him with fear and rejection. They would meet him with anticipation. The man who had been the greatest evidence of Satan's power had become the greatest trophy of God's grace, and he would not rest until everyone knew the name of the one who had crossed the storm for him. Seasons changed in the Decapolis. The heat of summer gave way to the cooling winds of autumn, and then to the rains of winter. But a different kind of season was turning in the hearts of the people. For months, the man who had been the prisoner of the tombs had walked the dusty roads of the 10 cities. He had become a familiar sight, not as a vagrant, but as a prophet of hope. His voice, once a source of terror, was now a source of wonder. He had spoken in the marketplaces of Gadara, the amphitheaters of Scythopolis, and the gates of Pella. He had told his story until his throat was dry and his feet were blistered. And slowly, the tide began to turn. At first, the people had been defensive, mourning the loss of their swine and fearing the strange power of the Jewish teacher. But the man's presence was an unanswerable argument. A father would look at his own son, tormented by seizures or madness, and then look at the man who stood before him calm, articulate, and whole. The question began to shift from, "How much did we lose?" to "What could we gain?" Then came the rumor. It started with the traders coming from the western shore. They spoke of the teacher moving again. They said he had fed 5,000 men with a few loaves of bread. They said he walked on water. They said he was healing the blind and the lame in Gennesaret. The news electrified the Decapolis. The man heard it while he was mending a net by the shore, helping his brother. A merchant from Capernaum stopped by, wiping sweat from his brow. "He is coming back," the merchant said casually. "The prophet. He is heading toward the region of the 10 cities again." The man dropped the net. His heart leaped into his throat. He had been waiting for this moment. He had been preparing the soil for this very harvest. He did not wait. He ran to the city square. He found the very elders who had asked Jesus to depart months ago. They were older now, and the economic sting of the lost herd had faded, replaced by a growing curiosity about the stories spreading through their land. "He is returning," the man announced, breathless. "The one who saved me. He is coming back to our coast." The elder who had banished Jesus looked at the man. He looked at the scars that were now just faint white lines on the man's arms. He remembered the fear that had gripped the town, but he also remembered the power. "We sent him away," the elder said quietly. "Why would he return to a people who chose pigs over him?" "Because he is not like us," the man replied with conviction. "We hold grudges. He holds mercy. He is coming not to judge you for the past, but to offer you a future. But this time, we must not meet him with fear. We must meet him with hunger." The man spent the next few days running. He was a herald on fire. He went from village to village, climbing the hills, shouting the news. "The healer is coming. Bring the sick. Bring the lame. Do not hide your suffering. Come to the shore." The atmosphere was different this time. There was no dread. There was an electric anticipation. The man had done his work. He had taken the rejection of the city and transformed it into readiness. The groundwork was laid. The way was prepared. The day Jesus returned, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The Sea of Galilee was calm, as if remembering the command that had silenced it before. When the boat appeared on the horizon, it was not met by a lonely, screaming madman among the tombs. It was met by a multitude. Thousands of people lined the shore. They had come from all the cities of the Decapolis, bringing their lame, their blind, their mute, and their maimed. They sat on the grass, a vast sea of humanity waiting for the touch of the divine. The man stood at the front of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the approaching vessel. As the boat grounded on the sand, a hush fell over the thousands. Jesus stepped out. He looked at the crowd. He saw the faces of Gentiles, people who did not know the law of Moses, people who worshipped strange gods, people who had once valued livestock above his presence. But he did not see enemies. He saw sheep without a shepherd. Then his eyes found the man. They locked gazes across the short distance. There were no words spoken, for none were needed. In the eyes of the man, there was an outpouring of gratitude and a silent report. "I have done as you commanded. I went home, I told them, and here they are." In the eyes of Jesus, there was recognition and approval. The seed that had been planted in the chaotic soil of a graveyard had produced a harvest that covered the hillside. The solitary missionary had brought a nation to the feet of the king. The elders of the city stepped forward. There was no talk of pigs this time. There was no request for him to leave. They bowed low, a gesture of submission and desperate need. "Teacher," one of them said, his voice trembling, "we have brought our sick. We have heard the testimony of the one you healed. We believe he speaks the truth." Jesus smiled. It was a smile of redemption. He walked into the crowd, and the work began. For 3 days, the hillside became a sanctuary of miracles. The man watched as Jesus moved among the people. He saw limbs that were twisted straighten out. He saw eyes that were milky with blindness suddenly flash with the recognition of light. He saw the mute open their mouths and speak their first words in praise of the God of Israel. The man walked among the people he had grown up with. He saw his neighbors, once hard-hearted and superstitious, now weeping with joy. He saw the transformation of his entire culture. They were glorifying the God of Israel, a God they had once thought was only for the Jews. The barrier had been broken. The wall of hostility had been torn down, not by a theological debate, but by the power of a testimony. The man realized that his suffering those long, agonizing years in the tombs had not been in vain. His pain had been the key that unlocked the door for thousands to enter the kingdom. Among the crowd, there was a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. His friends, emboldened by the stories the healed demoniac had told them, brought him to Jesus. They begged the teacher just to lay his hand on him. The man who had been legion watched closely. He understood what it was like to be trapped inside oneself, unable to communicate, cut off from the world of sound and reason. He felt a deep kinship with this suffering stranger. Jesus did something unusual. He took the deaf man aside, away from the multitude. He treated him with dignity, just as he had treated the man in the tombs. He put his fingers into the man's ears, and after spitting, he touched the man's tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, Jesus sighed. It was a sigh that resonated with the man watching from a distance. It was a sigh that carried the weight of the world's brokenness, a groan of the spirit against the damage that sin and Satan had done to humanity. "Ephphatha," Jesus commanded, "be opened." And immediately, the man's ears were opened, the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. The crowd erupted. They were astonished beyond measure. The chant began to rise from the multitude, echoing off the same cliffs where the pigs had once rushed to their deaths. "He has done all things well," they shouted. "He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The man closed his eyes and let the words wash over him. "He has done all things well." How different this cry was from the screams of the past. How different from the fearful plea, "Depart from us." The narrative of the region had been rewritten. The place of the curse had become the place of blessing. The land of the dead had become a nursery of life. Later, as the sun began to set on the third day, Jesus called his disciples. The crowd had been with them for 3 days and had nothing to eat. Just as he had fed the 5,000 in Galilee, Jesus took 7 loaves and a few small fish. He gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the multitude. The man sat on the grass, holding a piece of broken bread. He ate with the thousands, 4,000 men, besides women and children. It was a communion of the redeemed. He looked at the bread in his hand and thought of the emptiness that used to fill his soul. Now he was full. His belly was full, his heart was full, and his land was full of the presence of God. The fragments were gathered up 7 large baskets full. It was a sign of abundance. Where the demons had brought destruction and loss, Jesus had brought multiplication and leftovers. The debt of the 2,000 pigs had been paid back 1,000-fold in the currency of grace. The time came for Jesus to leave again. He entered the boat with his disciples to cross over to the region of Dalmanutha. This time, the man did not beg to go with him. He did not cling to the side of the boat in desperation. He stood on the shore, his feet planted firmly in the sand of his homeland. He understood his assignment now. He was not just a survivor, he was a watchman. He was the keeper of the flame in the Decapolis. He watched the boat cut through the water until it was just a silhouette against the setting sun. He felt a pang of longing, for he loved the teacher more than life itself, but it was a longing mixed with profound peace. He knew that the spirit of the teacher was with him, closer than his own breath. The crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their cities and villages. They walked differently now. They walked as people who had touched heaven. They would go back to their shops, their farms, and their families, but they would never be the same. The leaven had been placed in the dough, and it would rise until it changed everything. The man remained alone on the beach as the stars began to come out. He turned and looked up at the cliffs. He saw the dark openings of the tombs where he had wasted years of his life. They looked different now. They were just holes in the rock. They held no terror. They were empty, just as the tomb of his old life was empty. He walked up the path, passing the place where the chains had once bound him. He reached the top of the hill and looked out over the darkened sea. The wind blew through his hair, clean, fresh air, carrying the scent of rain. He thought about the legion. They were gone, banished to the abyss or wandering in dry places, stripped of their power over him. He thought about the townspeople. They were sleeping peacefully in their beds, no longer afraid of the screams in the night. He realized then that his story was not over. It was just beginning. He was the first fruit of a harvest that would continue for centuries. He did not know that one day great churches would be built on this soil. He did not know that his testimony would be written in a book that would travel to the ends of the earth, read by millions of people in languages not yet born. He only knew one thing. He had been dead, and now he was alive. He had been a captive, and now he was free. He turned his back on the sea and looked toward the sleeping cities of the Decapolis. There was work to do. There were more stories to tell, more chains to break, more hungry souls to feed with the truth he had been given. "Go home to your friends," the master had said. "I am home," the man whispered to the wind, and with a heart full of unshakable joy, the man who had conquered a legion walked back into the city, ready to live for the one who had died to save him.